President Trump's been in office for roughly a week, and in that time, he signed multiple dozen executive orders on topics relating to immigration, citizenship, and the declassification of the JFK files. And over the past couple of months, while running for office and now being president once again, one of the things he's been most adamant on has been the implementation of a 25% tariff on incoming Canadian products into the United States.
Canada has been very tough to deal with over the years, and it's not fair that we should have a $200 billion or $250 billion deficit.
For a while, a lot of Canadians saw this tariff threat as nothing more than a bluff or a jab at Canada, in parallel to how Trump's been outspoken about Canada potentially becoming the 51st state. But with continued emphasis from the president on these topics, Canadian leaders haven't had a choice but to weigh in on the issue in an attempt to defend Canada's position, of course, especially after hearing Trump's side of the Trudeau at Mar-a-Lago story.
And I asked him, what would happen if we didn't do that, if we didn't subsidize Canada? He said we'd be a failed nation.
And while the federal government, along with Ontario's Premier Doug Ford, have taken a position of threatening the US with tariffs of their own on US imports into Canada, other premiers such as for Alberta, Quebec, and Saskatchewan have been more willing to play ball with Trump in a less combative manner.
Any kind of retaliation that we do on tariffs hurts Canadians. Let's be frank about that.
Short term though, if you're American, this means that the price of many goods exported from Canada would most likely rise. Things such as oil, natural gas, lumber, cars, and a whole bunch of other goods that Canada heavily trades with the US. Now we know that Donald Trump is a huge advocate of tariffs and seems to prefer them over the idea of actually taxing the American people on their income to generate revenue for the country. In fact, he's openly spoken about the idea of potentially eliminating federal income tax in the USA while making up for this lost revenue through trade tariffs. So while Donald Trump's tariffs on Canadian and Mexican exports are set to potentially come into effect as soon as February 1st, the Canadian government is already preparing for a pandemic level relief plan to, quote, be there to support and compensate Canadians and Canadian businesses. And honestly, this couldn't have come at a worse time for Canada, given the state of the loonie relative to the US dollar, and realistically, any further strain on the already struggling economy would only deepen the currency's bleeding. So let's talk a bit more about what we could expect if tariffs come into play. First and foremost, we need to consider that for the time being, we have very little detail to actually go off of, other than the fact that tariffs would most likely be 25% and would potentially come into effect on February 1st. But Trump hasn't yet released details about the scope of the tariffs, how long they'd be implemented for, or any other details, allowing Canada to actually craft a strategic retaliatory game plan if that's how it chooses to move forward. But if we were to consider that Trump's looking to implement an all-inclusive 25% tariff across the board on all Canadian exports, here's how that could actually impact both economies. According to data from the United Nations, Canada exported $459 billion worth of goods to the US in 2022 and $440 billion in 2023, making the US Canada's largest trading partner by a huge margin at around 77% of its total exports. On the other hand, the United States exported roughly $308 billion worth of goods to Canada in 2022, leading to this trade deficit that Donald Trump has spoken about as being the main reason to pursue tariffs and potentially make Canada even the 51st state.
I would love to see Canada be the 51st state.
So why does Canada export roughly $200 billion more to the US than it imports? Well, that's because its main export to the US is crude petroleum, oil, which the US is the largest consumer of on the planet at a rate of 7.4 billion barrels per year. And Canada happens to have a ton of oil, making for a good trading relationship between the two countries, although the president sees things differently.
Also, they've been very nasty to us on trade. historically, Canada has been very, very bad to us, very unfair to us on trade. So.
But let's say the US were to impose a 25% tariff on all goods exported from Canada. What does this mean for all of that oil and other products crossing the border? Who's actually going to directly pay that tariff? Is it Canadians or Americans? Which on oil exports for 2022 alone would be equivalent to nearly $30 billion in tariffs. Generally speaking, when a tariff is imposed, it's the importing business or person who pays said tariff on the foreign goods. Just think about the last time you ordered something online from, let's say, Europe and had to pay a huge surprise duty fee when taking delivery. You probably didn't make that mistake again. And so, although more complex, the same general idea applies here, where the American oil companies importing Canadian petroleum to refine and create gasoline would theoretically be the ones footing that 25% tariff, which would mean higher prices for goods sold in the US. On the other hand though, Canadian companies who massively rely on these exports to the US may not be in a position to afford losing out on that critical business, especially if American importers don't want to pay this premium, which is where we could see Canadian companies potentially having to absorb a large portion of this tariff, temporarily at least, to maintain export volumes, thus reducing profits both in the short and long term though. Ultimately, a tariff between the two countries would discourage and make trade more costly for the companies both importing and exporting goods across the border. And if Canada were to hit the US with a matching tariff of its own, we could expect to see the cost of goods increase drastically in both countries.
You can't bring a knife to a gunfight. Usually the guy with a knife loses one in a gunfight. We have to make sure that we match these tariffs dollar for dollar.
And we need to consider that whatever impact these tariffs end up having on either of the two economies, it's always the end consumer who will realistically suffer the financial consequences through further inflation, in this case, leading to a higher cost of goods in the US and Canada, along with a drop in overall Canadian GDP, which could devastate the country who's already struggling with low GDP growth figures. Oh, and that talk of inflation earlier doesn't even start to consider how a governmental relief package to support Canadian residents and businesses would artificially pump up more dollars into the economy, devaluating the Canadian dollar even further than it has already, as it did from the pandemic relief packages a couple years prior. Alright, now it's widely accepted that Canada is struggling with GDP growth, trailing miles behind the United States. Between 2012 and 2022, Canada experienced a mere 17% GDP growth, but only 4.36% increase in GDP per capita. And in contrast, the US achieved a striking 56.7% GDP growth and 47.5% rise in GDP per capita, meaning per individual in the US, during that same time period, over 10 years, 2012 to 2022, where this stark disparity highlights that Canada's per capita economic output has been growing at a significantly slower pace compared to the US, and a tariff war would only make things worse. Let's remember that Canada's largest trading partner is the US at roughly 77% of our exported goods. So to put it bluntly, a 25% export tariff would devastate the Canadian economy, as American companies would buy way less of our product over time, specifically oil, where Trump's been very adamant on increasing the US's own production.
That is why today I will also declare a national energy emergency. We will drill, baby, drill.
The bottom line is that more expensive exports means less business and ultimately less money flowing through our economy and the pockets of Canadian residents as well. According to the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, this 25% tariff could cost the average Canadian household $1,900 annually and shrink Canada's gross domestic product by 2.6% in the short term, which is huge. So when prices inevitably increase from this tariff war, consumers will have lower spending power to use as they see fit, as more money is flowing into the coffers of the government, which will mean that businesses of all kinds could see decreases in revenue, especially in industries such as consumer discretionary. So you're probably wondering, if tariffs would increase costs on both sides of the border, also hurting American citizens, why would Trump consider a measure like this? Well, of course, I'm not in his inner circle, but what we can see from the outside is that Trump's all about bringing jobs back to America and producing more in the country, while reducing trade with other countries to be less dependent on outside goods. So while a move like this one could hurt Americans in the short term, it would also make many companies that have supply chains across both borders, like in the car industry, for example, where parts often cross borders multiple times before actually becoming a final product, rethink their entire supply chain and ultimately choose to settle fully in the US, eliminating the headache of tariffs altogether and creating more American jobs long term. Let's remember that the US has the largest economy on the planet with massive consumer spending, so companies want to do business in the US, and Trump knows this, using it as leverage against countries like Canada, who's kind of at the mercy of their exports to the US, making up such a large portion of Canadian GDP.
If we have to put our country first for at least a period of time, we have to fix it.
So while a move like this one would hurt both countries, it would hurt Canada a heck of a lot more. Here's a chart showcasing the projected effect that a 25% tariff would have on the GDP of the US, Canada, and Mexico. It is quite clear looking at this chart that any negative impact these tariffs would have on the American GDP, it would be much worse and devastating for Canada and Mexico, especially in the first couple of years. The reason for this is that Canada relies on the US's purchases a lot more than the other way around. Again, 77% of Canada's exports head to the US, while the US exports to Canada only account for roughly 17% of their foreign trade. So for now, all we can do is speculate on the outcome of a trade war between the US and Canada, but no matter how it's sliced, any additional tariff imposed on Canadian exports would hurt the Canadian economy and Canadian dollar. The only smidge of leverage Canada ultimately has over the US is its abundance of resources, specifically oil, which we spoke about earlier as being Canada's largest export to the US, which consumes an unbelievable amount of oil. As it currently stands, the US has a daily oil deficit of roughly 7 million barrels per day. That is the difference between what it produces itself and what it consumes, where that extra 7 million barrels a day currently comes from foreign countries, mainly Canada, at roughly 4.3 million barrels daily, equivalent to around 60% of that oil deficit. So with this in mind, Canada's retaliatory options are either slapping the US with import tariffs of their own, or even more drastic, cutting the oil supply to the US temporarily or even altogether. Although that would be shooting ourselves in the foot as we massively rely on US oil exports. Both scenarios are bad news for Canada. Make sure to let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and also while you're down there, sign up for Moomoo and get some free money when funding a new TFSA. Top link in the pinned comment. Thanks all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.